Well, it's always a troublesome thing to follow, or to not be the lead-off speaker, because then you're always at the risk of following a talk like the one that I now have to follow, and I end up looking like the circus clown coming after Pink Floyd or something. So, and I was trying to figure out when I was coming in this morning how I was going to kind of link what I'm going to talk about and my sort of background with some of the other backgrounds here. And I couldn't quite figure out how to do that, given that I was coming from a physics background and engineering school. But then I was quite heartwarmed to find out that your son is doing his PhD in physics. So at least there's two of us. So at least there's a bit of a link. But I'm going to actually take a bit of a step back from what Jeremy was speaking about in the first talk, and kind of move back from sort of the frontline clinical aspect and move back a little bit into research. And talk about some possible techniques that we've been working on in our lab that might lend themselves to learning a little bit more about what's going on in Chiari syndrome and indeed most of the cerebellar syndrome, and how we might use that to sort of learn a little bit more, guide interventions, investigate efficacy of different interventions, and kind of take some next step forward. So, as I sort of introduced earlier, so I'm at the Brown University School of Engineering, but now also the Department of Pediatrics. We run the Advanced Baby Imaging Lab at Brown. Advanced for two reasons. One, we're an imaging lab, we're a research imaging lab, so you always have to be doing advanced imaging. You can never be doing conventional or last generation imaging. And of course we deal with kids and parents coming in, and really no one brings in a stupid child, right? Every parent believes their child is gifted and advanced, so we're kind of advanced in both ways. I will say that we do have some grant funding coming from Nestle, regardless of what you might think about them in terms of current water usage. They're actually a quite nice company when they're making coffee at least, and chocolate. Okay, again, one other thing just before we get kind of launching away here. Jeremy nicely mentioned that I have had the pleasure of working with some amazing people throughout my career. I also have the pleasure of working with some amazing people right now. So this is our group here, the Advanced Baby Imaging Lab at Brown, who I get to hang out with every day and work alongside. And really, I get to take credit for all their work because they're not here today. Well, actually, Justin is here, but everyone else is actually doing work, and I get to be here and have free breakfast and such. And of course, we'd be remiss if we didn't thank all the various funding agencies that we deal with. Okay, so taking a big step back, what do we do at the Baby Imaging Lab? What is our sort of ethos, and what's our sort of motivation and our goal moving forward? And we sort of toss around a lot of ideas and try to come up with nice little slogans, and we go off for retreats, and we listen to some funky music and whatnot, but really our good folks back at Sesame Street really laid it out for us a long time ago. And that is that some people just want to watch the world learn. And this kind of summarizes what we're trying to do. Okay? And in some cases, we might actually even want to cross out this watch and put in help. But that's really what we're coming from. And what do we mean by that? Well, we're really interested in how we go from this young gentleman on the left here, 1, 2, 3 months of age, and how we grow and develop into this fine young man here on the right, 5 or 6, 7, 8 years of age. And think about all the various behavioral and cognitive changes that occur over that time period. And again, if we think about we sort of truncate it down, think of the various stages of development, be it vision, emotion, etc. They all have their infancy at least within these first 5 years of life. Even things that we tend to think about being later developing, say peer social skills. Now, if you're a physicist like me, this may not start until somewhere over here, 30 to 40 years of age, if at all. But in general, for most people, they're starting down in the early first 5 years of life. And so perhaps not surprising then, there's a lot of changes going on in the brain development throughout those first 5 years of life. In fact, it is possibly the most dynamic period of brain maturation, starting again from the sort of deep cerebellar regions, brainstem, and then extending up into association regions, frontal and temporal regions. And again, so prenatally we have core brain structures are developing, we have early neuronal connections are formed, and cortical structure emerges. So all these things are happening prenatally, but then we're not just born and that's it, right? We're not sort of born as a whole. There's a tremendous amount of brain development that occurs, again, across these first 5 years of life, postnatally. And that really kind of brings down to these various activity-driven processes, be it synaptogenesis, synaptic pruning, And the one that we're going to talk about today predominantly is myelination, which is actually the most visually striking change in these latter images here, from about 3 months of age all the way up to 2 years of age. Okay. And while these processes really are lifelong, again, just to kind of drive the point home of why we're really interested in these first 5 years of life, they are the most rapid over the first, say, these first 1,000 days or the first 2 years. Just to give you an example, this is total brain volume curves, again, derived from brain imaging, for example. Showing these curves, we can look at myelination as well, and even changes in the cortical structure. And if you just go out to about 1,000 days, if you include gestation, about 90% of brain development has occurred by the time you turn 2. Right? So there's a tremendous amount of development that's happening over those first 2 to 5 years of life. Okay, and again, that's your first 1,000 days. Now, again, we're really interested in what's going on in terms of myelination. That's going to be our predominant process that we're really interested in. And so what is this myelin? So for everyone who's in med school, this is a refresher. For everyone who is a doctor, this is even more of a refresher. For those of us who come from engineering, this is new territory. So what is myelin? Well, if we sort of take this lovely picture of a brain, we know that it's composed of a whole bunch of different fibers that are linking up all these different brain regions. And if we look at each of those axons, then this myelin is really just a fatty layer that wraps around those myelin, or those axons, right? And what this basically does is it helps in 2 ways. One, it massively speeds communication across your brain. So rather than having to, if you think about, say, electrical engineering, we have a wire. How electricity actually transfers is you actually bump an electron point by point by point by point. And that's very, very energetically expensive, and it's very slow. Okay? What myelin allows that same electrical signal to do is, instead of going point by point by point, it's actually jumping between those nodes, those points between the myelin sheath. Okay, so that actually reduces the amount of energy that's required to send a message, and it increases it by about 10,000 times. So if we didn't have there's been some estimates that if we didn't have a myelinated brain, our brain would have to be 3 times as big, and we'd have to eat 30 times as much food. Now you can imagine if we came out fully formed with a brain 3 times, or the head 3 times as big, our parents would have even more guilt on us for the birthing process than they already do. Right? Okay, so that's the process, and that's what myelin is for. And if we actually go and look at that structure, it is made up of these lipid layers that get wrapped around the axon. And actually it turns out that the more wraps you put on, the faster the communication occurs. Okay, so the thicker your myelin sheath, the faster the communication. Okay, so functionally that myelin sheath acts to speed the electrical impulses along the axon. And again, as I said, if we start off with a single wrap, those electrical signals pass fairly slowly. As we add more and more layers, more and more lipid bilayer wraps, those messages, that transfer time becomes faster and faster and faster. Okay. What makes it interesting to us, and kind of brings it back to this idea of development and looking at function, is there are temporal relationships, spatial temporal relationships, between the process of myelination and cognitive development. So when you are developing a skill, be it walking, it is your motor system that is myelinating. When you're developing language, it's your language systems that are myelinating. So there's this really nice yin and yang relationship between myelination and cognitive maturation. And so this has led to this idea that really to learn is to myelinate, both throughout childhood, but then also in adulthood. So in plasticity studies that are now going on even in adolescence, in older aging, and in dementia, it really is actually myelin that can be changed within the white matter in response to learning. Be it, for example, learning how to drive a car, or even driving your black cabbie around London, learning a musical instrument, learning how to juggle, or some complex games, be it Go or whatnot. Okay, so that kind of really lays out why this process of myelination is important and why we're really quite interested in it. So what do? So our sort of main ethos then is really to understand how that process occurs across early childhood, how we link it into cognitive maturation and functional maturation, and then we want to understand all the various genetic, environmental, nutritional, and learning influences that really go into shaping these structure-function relationships. And then, of course, we really want to understand how these things are changed in various behavioral disorders, psychiatric disorders, or intellectual disorders. And so let's take a step back then and try to think about, well, what is this normal process of myelination? What does that actually look like in the typically developing child? And it turns out that we actually don't really have a fantastically good idea of how normal myelination proceeds in a typically developing child. And the reason for that is almost all of our information comes from histological studies done at the turn of the last century, around 1910 to 1925. And of course, if you're going to do histological studies, those are by definition not typically developing children. A typically developing child doesn't pass away at 3 months of age. And it also becomes a bit tricky to do structure-function relationships when the child has already passed away. Okay? So we don't actually know a tremendous amount about how these processes actually occur. Well, that then brings in the idea of, well, what do we have available at our hands now? Well, we have all sorts of imaging techniques now. Right? We have CT, ultrasound, and more importantly, we have magnetic resonance imaging. Can we use those techniques to go in and kind of understand these processes? Those are non-invasive techniques. Can we go and use those? And indeed we can. However, we're then presented with another problem. What do our past studies using MRI tell us about this process of myelination? And let's say we're going to be interested in going from, say, about a month of age all the way up to maybe early pre-adolescence. So we're going to even go over the first 5 years, 5-6 years of life and go up into adolescence. What does MRI tell us? If we go back and look at all the studies that have been done, it turns out there's a bit of a problem. We don't have this nice lifespan. We can't go and create a nice image of how the brain develops over these periods. Okay, what we actually have is two islands. We have a tremendous amount of knowledge of what's going on in the first 5-6 months of age. Then it kind of falls off. There's not many studies done over the first year. It's a few, not many. And they kind of definitely go away between 2 and 3 years of age. And then they begin to pick back up at 4, 5, 6, 7 years of age. Okay, so we have a large number of MRI studies that have been done in that sort of early postnatal stage, 1, 2, 3 months. Whole whack of them up once you get into adolescence, but not a lot in between. Anyone have an idea why that is? Movement, right? You ever tried to put a kiddo at 3 years of age into a scanner without sedation? Right? Has anyone had an MR scan, perchance? Right? What do you remember about that experience?
First one or the second one?
Well, either one.
Wow.
The first one I was a little claustrophobic, so the second one, it's a long time. You have to be very still, and because I had claustrophobia the first time, I made sure it didn't happen the second time. So it was easier to be still and relax.
Right. So you kind of hit the major points there, right? So it's a small claustrophobic environment. You have to be really still for a long period of time, and then someone else shouted out it's really loud, right? All of those are exactly why we have this problem, right? In essence, to take this little dude and put them into this great big machine is like putting these two things together, right? They just don't really mix that well, right? It leads to a lot of these. Okay, tears both on the part of the child, but also on the part of the research team that's trying to do this. Okay, so again, we're trying to do this all in typically healthy developing kids, right? So we can't use the make go sleep now drugs. We can't knock them out and give them an Ativan lollipop, right? So we have to do this all under non-sedated cases and situations. Okay, so really it comes down to these things, right? We can ask a 2-year-old to stay still, but they tend not to. As I say, parents and definitely IRBs will dislike sedation in the case of healthy kids if we don't have a clinical reason to do that scan. MRI scanners are not nice places to take a nap. So this is the usual approach, right? We have them fall asleep, and then we put them into the scanner. But as you know, it's quite loud, so we then subsequently wake them back up. And even if you do get past all of these problems, and say you're going to go to an older child, 4 or 5 years of age, who you can bribe to go in, you're still often left with this huge dark tunnel of death that you now have to put them into. Okay? And they may talk a big game until they see it. And then that all goes down quite quickly. But moreover, also MRI doesn't really tell us that too much about myelination. And why is that? Well, let's go and take a look at that problem. So these are your standard images that you'd acquire, T1 weighted and T2 weighted images that you might do clinically, taken over the lifespan up until 10 years of age. And yeah, if you look at T1, you can see the nice hyperintensity changes in the internal capsules initially, then moving down to optic gradations and up into the front. As you see that nice change in white matter, the hyperintensity of the white matter versus gray matter. Flip side in the T2, where you actually have hyperintense white matter signal and hypointense gray matter signal, and that alters and flips as we get older. And again, these processes generally follow the rate that we're used to in seeing myelination. We can look at DTI as well, which is a technique that Jeremy mentioned before, so looking at fractional anisotropy or the coherence of water movement. And again, we can see those changes with age. But do these really tell us a lot about myelination? Yes, they are occurring alongside myelination, but are they specific? And to answer that question is no, they're not specific. And we can answer that really quickly by simply looking at neonates. This is images taken out of a 1-week-old. There is no myelin in a 1-week-old brain, except for in the brainstem and the cerebellum. This is all higher than the brainstem and the cerebellum, so there should be no signal here. If we're only getting signal from myelin, there should be no signal in any of these images. But since we are seeing signal, we know that we're getting signal from other sources. And so while we might be sensitive to changes in myelin, we're not specific to it. Okay, so that leads to a bit of an issue and something that I want to drive home, because everyone here will hear, oh, I had a change in FA value. That's clearly a change in myelination. No, it is not. Okay? MRI contrasts are sensitive, but not specific to changing myelin content. So how do we get around that? Well, we have a technique that we call mcDESPOT. It's kind of McDonald's in northern Iran, brought together. Okay, and we won't test you on what it stands for, but basically what we think it is a rapid technique for quantitative myelin content imaging. And the basic idea is that if we take an image and we look at a single voxel, a single little point, how we typically think of that signal is like this. We typically think of it this here. This is how a physicist sees the brain. Okay, just a great big square with water. That's it. Okay, that's a physicist's representation of the brain, and it's brain water. And we have single relaxation properties that describe that water, and a similar number of protons that are inside of that. Okay, if we want to be a little bit more fancy, we want to take the physics 2.0 view of the brain. We end up with, hang on, oops. I'll hop over here. Okay, so what that means is if we actually went back and looked at the signal, we would have just a single MRI signal represented by a single curve. Okay. Let's say if we want to go to physics 2.0 of what our brain looks like, this is a physics 2.0 view of the brain. So we actually have multiple different pieces of water. And so this is, for example, water that's in between those lipid bilayers of the myelin sheath, water that's inside the axon, and water that's outside the axon. And then we can all let them all just exchange. Okay, so that's what each of our tissue voxels inside of each of our throughout our brain looks like. And so as a result, we don't have one single curve, we have multiple curves that add up to that measured signal. And of course, if we have this, then we can do some mathematical magic, fit curves to each one of these, and pull them out and selectively identify just the myelin water signal. And if you can selectively identify that, then you can quantify it, and you can come up with a map of just that myelin water. Okay, so in essence, we take a single image, we do a whole bunch of sophisticated image processing, and we pull out these individual maps. And for example, that myelin water fraction is really the fractional signal associated with myelin content. And it's a surrogate measure of myelin content, which is a quantitative value. So when you sort of cruise your cursor around that image, you'll get a value that ranges from 1% to 100%, 100% being that your voxel is entirely myelin, 1% being it's only 1% myelin. And that value shouldn't change, right? Unless you're aging, etc. But if we go and take you and scan you in multiple scanners, we'll get the same value back. Okay, we can go back and make sure that actually works. For example, we can go and compare this in animal models that don't myelinate, compare that with histology, or similarly we can do it in mouse models where we feed them a cuprazone diet that causes them to demyelinate and then remyelinate, and again, go back and compare our imaging measures with histology. Okay, so now that we think we have an imaging technique that is a bit more sensitive and specific to myelin content, the question is now we have to overcome this problem, right? It's all well and good to have a technique that measures myelin content, but if you can't actually apply it in the kiddos, then it's really not that useful to you. So how do we go and solve this problem? We want to get rid of that. We want to have them nicely sleeping away. So we are basically going to scan all of our kids during normal non-sedated sleep. So we basically have all of our kids come in the evening, they fall asleep, and we move them into the scanner. For kids that are a bit older, 4 or 5 years of age, we can bribe them, right? We can say there'll be $20 when you get out, or you get to watch a movie while you're in the scanner, or we go for ice cream afterwards. and that tends to make them a little bit more happy. To facilitate all this, we've done a lot of work on the physics side to bring the scanner noise down. So again, if you notice the sound of a scanner, it typically runs at about 100 decibels, which is about the sound of a rock concert. We can bring that down to about 60 dBs. That doesn't sound like that big, but it's a logarithmic scale, so 60 dB is actually what it's like in a library. Okay, so they actually have no idea that the scanner is running. The downside of making the scanner run quieter is it takes longer to acquire our data. So it takes about 35 to 45 minutes to acquire our data. Instead, if we were to go put ourselves in there and run it as maximum, it would be about 18 minutes or so. Okay, so we take a bit of a hit. All of this basically involves us sitting around waiting for this to happen. We basically bring all of our parents in. We have a number of these sort of sleepy rooms set up. Kids come in, they fall asleep in this blue pack and play, in pack and play on top of this blue immobilizer. Once they've fallen asleep, we lift that whole thing out, put it onto a glorified mail cart, move them into the scanner, put the head coil on, put on little headphones for them, play a lovely soothing sound of white noise, and then into the scanner. And then inside the scanner, in addition to doing some physics magic, we've also put in this noise canceling foam. And that all, again, brings all this noise down to about 40 dB. Okay? And everything, all this is done during complete darkness. So we're kind of sort of moving around, trying to not to bump into each other as we're trying to sort all this out. For the older kids, again, we're trying to do this while they're awake. And so to make the scanner look a little bit more friendly, a little less clinical, we do dress it up. So we do either have a space shuttle, and of course, what space shuttle is true without an astronaut or ground crew. And we also have a princess castle or a king's castle, depending on whether it's a boy or a girl that wants to go in. And clearly, what is a castle without its princesses or fairies? So we also have that as well. To give you an idea, this is actually all done at night. So that's us with our infrared camera trying to put all this together, put a little 2-year-old in this case into the scanner at night, or during the day trying to get them all set up. And they do actually seem like they're actually having a good time. He's not crying for help and waving for his parents. Okay, so we do a pretty broad spectrum of measures. Again, the main one being this myelin content, which we can then break down and look at, say, cortical content as well as white matter content. But we get a range of images. I know Jeremy talked about functional connectivity and structural connectivity, so we acquire those as well. But our predominant measure that we're interested in right now is myelin content. And if we want to look at how that looks this is your emerging brain. Okay, so at the top there is your myelin water fraction image, taken at every 3 months until they turn 2, and then 6 months until age 5. Next row down is quantitative T1, quantitative T2, your fractional anisotropy, or your diffusion measure, and then just what a standard T1 weighted image would look like. Okay, so you get some nice sense that we do actually see a lot of brain development. We can also, one thing that was talked about last talk was this idea of functional connectivity and looking at how brain regions are linked up on a functional level. We can also look at that. So these are actually functional connections that are increasing with child age. So you see that basically, well, most of the brain is increasing, but certainly inter-hemisphere connections are increasing across both right and left hemisphere, whereas intra-hemisphere connections are decreasing with age. So we're wiring up, becoming more of a connected brain as we grow older. But what's kind of interesting is although we're wiring up and we're becoming more and more efficient, our actual efficiency doesn't change. So this is kind of a weird thing. So these are actually measures of global and local efficiency of our networks. They actually don't change with age. So even though we're having all these tremendous changes going on in our brain, between between about 1 month of age and up to 5, the actual efficiency of the brain isn't changing. It's kind of strange. Okay, so quickly, as we kind of cruise over time here, how do we go back and link this process up with changing brain function? And so we've done this using standard neuroimaging assessments that we acquire alongside all of our imaging data. And the predominant one we're going to focus on there is that one in the red to the left, the Mullen scales of early learning. Very similar to an intelligence test that you do in an older child. It basically looks at behavior across 5 major domains: gross motor, fine motor, visual function, expressive and receptive language. And then you can group some of these into an overall composite score, for example, the early learning composite, which is very similar to full-scale IQ in an older child. And we can go back and we can look at the correlations between that with, say, changing myelination. This is done in toddlers between 1 and 2 years of age. And again, you get the sense that not only is deep white matter important for overall cognitive function, but certainly pulling into that cerebellum, playing a very, very strong role for overall cognition. Again, kind of highlighting the point that it's not just motor, right? It's being involved in both visual processing as well as language. And we can look at that a little bit further as we break down. And so this is actually looking at verbal and nonverbal. So nonverbal associations are shown in blue. Verbal associations are shown in red. We do see the nonverbal or motor being associated with cerebellum, but actually if you took away the blue, there's a big red dot in the center there as well. So nonverbal is also associated in these same kids. Okay. If we can also go back and look at, well, how do changes? We have longitudinal data in all these kiddos. So can we look at longitudinal patterns of development? And are they associated with overall maturation? So again, sort of taking that ELC value and looking at high achieving children versus low achieving children and breaking that down and looking at overall development. So this is whole brain white matter maturation, but actually if you actually focused in and just looked at cerebellar development, you get very similar curves. Showing again this differentiation in overall myelination and development associated with cognitive outcomes. Okay, so everyone seems to almost match up over the first year or so, and it's really between 1 year and 2 years that you begin to get this spread that ultimately by 2 and 3 years of age shows an overall difference in myelin content between your above average children, so these would be your children with an IQ of 115 to 120 and above, versus your low children, so 75, or well 85 and 80 and lower. We can also look at changes in functional connectivity associated with function, again being driven by myelin. So this is just looking at different functional domains, be it visual function, receptive language, or fine motor. And again, we're sort of sat up high in terms of the brain regions that we're looking at here. But if we went down a little bit, you'll see cerebellum kind of popping in. So even cerebellum is associated again with visual functioning. It's in here as well, obviously for receptive language. And then perhaps not surprising if we went down a little bit further, it's involved in fine motor as well. So again, kind of highlighting the importance of the cerebellar function to not only motor, but to all these other domains. So just to finalize then, how can we go and take this and move this into investigating and understanding Chiari a little bit? Well, we know that it's pretty common as a disorder in a relative sense. But there's really not a lot known about overall developmental profiles. And a lot of this really does come back to that initial problem that we talked about, that it's quite difficult to image kiddos. And so if we can't image kiddos and we can't understand what's going on, then it's quite, we can't get these developmental profiles. There have been some early studies, there's been a few, but again, most of them focus on older kids. So they start at those 6, 7, 8 years of age and go forward. They tend to focus on Chiari 2 malformations, and the most restrictive bit is that they're all very, very small studies, so less than 10. Both reflective of the relative rarity of the disorder, but also just highlighting the difficulty in scanning these kiddos. But if we go back and we just look at myelination, you can get an idea, and we focus in on that cerebellum. Again, we know that this follows a very characteristic developmental profile. Okay. The cerebellum is one of the first areas that myelinates. It's actually myelinating before birth, about 20 weeks it begins, and then continues on. So it really adds as a foundation. Right? And without sort of building that foundation, much like a house, the top of the house can't be as high. Okay. So we really want to build that foundation as strong as possible. And we can break that a little bit further. And for example, we can look at development. And so you can see the ages just across the first 2 years. You can look at the development of the cerebellum in different planes. So just kind of moving superiorly here. You can kind of get a good sense of how this structure is growing. And so this is normative, healthy, typically developing child development. The question is, can we now use these as ways, and sort of a template, as you will, to go back and have an understanding of what's going on in these various disease states. And so that's where we're kind of headed now. So I think now that we've kind of shown that this technique is useful and can be applied and can be rigorously and pretty reproducibly applied in young kiddos, we can use this now as a reference template to go and acquire data in children who may be affected or have these malformations and understand what's going on, not only in certain terms of the cerebellum, but also throughout the brain. And again, if we can do that, then we automatically open ourselves up for prospective randomized control trials of understanding how intervention affects overall outcomes. And to give an idea of how we can do this, I just want to sort of take a bit of a left turn and give an idea of what I kind of envision for this by looking at what we've been doing in MS. Okay, so a completely different disorder, but kind of lays down the same general idea of what I'm thinking of. And so we have a number of imaging technologies that we can use in MS. The downside is that typically images look the same. So these are two relapsing remitting MS patients. Generally same characteristics, but very different disability scores. But if you're looking at their standardized images that you'd acquire, these are just T2 FLAIR images, they look very the same. There's very much the same number of lesions. The lesion location is very much the same. But if we go and actually do a myelin imaging measure on them, that becomes a little bit different. You can kind of begin to tease apart a little bit. But certainly if we go back and we compare those with normative development, so a normal adult at the same age, and do z-scores in the same way that we do z-scores for behavioral measures. In this case, we're doing a z-score on myelin content. That begins to show up a lot. Okay, so we begin to start to see all these areas here that have significantly affected white matter in these purple areas, which becomes very different between the two cases. And in fact, we can see that if we go through. And again, just kind of highlighting this difference between what we know is being effective in terms of white matter versus what we're seeing on a conventional MRI image. So you can imagine applying the same approach into children with Chiari to get an idea of what is going on globally as well as specifically within the cerebellum and how things are changing, which we might not normally be able to see from a conventional T1, T2, or T2 FLAIR weighted image. Okay, and so that's kind of where we can be headed as we work forward, and certainly looking forward to doing so. But just to summarize really quickly, because I can imagine everyone is anxious to get outside for their coffee. We know that white matter development and particularly myelination play pretty critical roles in behavioral and functional development. I think longitudinal studies, which is again something that hasn't been done in Chiari, they tend to be very cross-sectional in nature, but certainly longitudinal studies can offer some important insights into development, as well as the roles and the causes of potential pre- and postnatal influences and alterations. I think that the existing database that we've built up, so I've showed you just some of the data, that actually represents about 2,500 scans from over 500 kids that we've put together. And so that's a pretty extensive database that we can use, which we can then use for both the discovery of abnormalities at different ages, as well as how those potential abnormalities change with age. The imaging methods that we've shown, particularly the mcDESPOT approach, is readily adaptable to pediatric populations. We've applied it not only in healthy, typically developing children, but we've done it in autistic children, children with ADHD and conduct disorder, children with pediatric epilepsy, as well as pediatric MS. So it's not just limited to a healthy child or a child that we can sort of talk into getting into the scanner. The other thing is that although we've done it here and it takes a little bit of time because we're doing it whilst the child is naturally sleeping, if we have the opportunity to do it in a clinical setting with sedation, again, we can bring those imaging times down such that it could be added onto an existing clinical scan. And the hope is that then it can offer some new insight into developmental profiles associated with children who may have Chiari malformations. And then as well, as I say, investigate the possible impact of surgical interventions. And so I'll leave it there, but happy to take any questions, and if not, guide everyone out for coffee. There we go.
Very interesting potential new methods, but the one slide there that actually concerned me more than, as I think more about it, it keeps worrying me more, is that your average cognitive development and your underdeveloping cognitive development showed absolutely no difference in myelin density.
Yep.
How is that possible?
Yeah, so I think Well, there's a couple things. So one is that was averaged over the whole brain. So when you actually begin to pick apart and look at different brain regions, different things start to pop out. But I think the other thing is that it begins to highlight, I think, the importance of not where you got, but how you got there. So if you actually looked at those curves, there is a slight separation between 1 and 2 years of age, even though they collapse back upon each other by about 5 years of age. And so if we look, that's a similar actual, those are similar trajectories as you may see in autistic versus healthy developing kids, right? If you just look at overall brain volume, they tend to be very, depending on when you look, you can get a difference or a not difference. They tend to normalize with age. So I think it kind of highlights two things. One is it is the path of how you got somewhere. That's important. But also when you start looking at different brain regions, those curves begin to do different things. So that was just a global. Yeah, otherwise we'd be in a big pickle. Yeah.
Have you used this technique with post-traumatic stress disorders to see if there are any changes that are showing up?
Not
Military population?
Yeah, not yet. We have definitely applied it into TBI. So we're kind of we're inching our way towards PTSD. But certainly we do see actually differences in even MTBI. So which gives us some insight that it might be related to, or we might be able to see some differences in stress disorder as well. Yeah, particularly when you start looking at the HPA axis and that sort of stuff.
Does mcDESPOT mean that you acquire the image differently or that you analyze them differently? Can you apply mcDESPOT to existing?
Sadly not.
Okay.
Yeah, so there is a particular acquisition strategy that goes along, and then the analysis that comes along with it. But in general, at least on the T1 side, the good thing is that they are clinical sequences. So it's not like you have to go out and buy a new set of acquisition strategies. It's just how you acquire the data becomes a bit tricky. But yeah, sadly we can't just. If not, we'd be doing all sorts of stuff right now.
Do you or others have evidence that any mass or compression focal along the white matter tract causes either impedes development of white matter in that tract or degenerates existing myelin? Can you see that using your technique? Or?
I mean, we certainly see it in hydrocephalus, for example, where you at least have impinging of the ventricles onto white matter. In terms of whether beyond that, no. So that's future work.
Sean, thank you very much.